Good day. After the fighting in the eastern sector of the Zaporozhye line, much of which was actually located in southern Donetsk, fighting in which Ukraine failed, as far as I can see, to make any gains at all, but does appear to have suffered extremely heavy losses. About those more later. The main Ukrainian attack, or rather the main direction of the Ukrainian attack, started to emerge yesterday with a big Ukrainian force attacking Russian positions south of the town of Orekhov. Now, this has been widely predicted, the most plausible view about what Ukraine would do. It's been widely acknowledged would be that they would try to break through from Orekhov towards the town of Tokmak, further south within Zaporozhye region. Tokmak is under Russian control, and then having broken through to Tokmak, they would try to move on to capture Melitopol, and if that is successful, then they'll press on further, or perhaps might decide to press on further all the way to the Sea of Azov to cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea. That's been the plan that people have been talking about and discussing ever since last autumn, and we've seen that this is precisely what Ukraine started to try to do yesterday. And I said yesterday they started to do it. It went on right through the night. It's continuing this morning. There's been intense fighting, and information has been coming almost exclusively from Russian commentators about what has been going on. But the overall picture is not so far good for Ukraine. There's been attacks during the day, a major attack during the night, more attacks this morning. But as of the time of making of this video, Ukraine has not captured any significant ground. There's been suggestions that they might have advanced 100 meters here or 100 meters there, but they've not managed to capture any settlement. They've failed to have overrun fully any Russian fortified position. They've not, in other words, so far at least, broken through. And I would like again to reiterate that all of these fights, all this fighting that's been taking place since Sunday, has happened so far not in the area of these enormous fortifications which the Russians built to the south. They're happening still to the north of these huge fortified positions, which are layered. There are several layers of these fortifications which Ukraine would have to break through. All of these battles, all of this fighting so far is taking place well to the north of these fortifications in attacks on Russian forward positions, which might be considered, some people talk it as a first line of defense. Perhaps it's more correct to define it as a sort of crumple zone, using Simplicius the Thinker's language, or perhaps a control area, an area of control that the Russians have in front of their fortified lines. But anyway, the fighting has been taking place there. I'm not going to discuss in detail the nature of this fighting. I don't think one can, but suffice to say that so far there has been no reports of any Ukrainian breakthrough. They haven't yet managed to make any serious advances. They haven't yet approached or come anywhere close to the fortified lines. Now, it does seem that a large number of tanks have been used in these operations. My sense is that these are not yet the major Western tanks, the Western tanks that we've been hearing so much about, the Leopard 2s and the Challenger 2s. Those are still being held back in reserve for the big breakthrough, which they hope to make when they finally reach the fortified lines. At the moment, the tanks I think that Ukraine is operating are a mix of whatever T-64 tanks, Soviet-era T-64 tanks, Ukraine has left. The T-64 used to be built in Kharkiv, the tank factory there, which has, as I understand it, been largely destroyed over the course of this fighting. But the T-64 was the mainstay of the Ukrainian armoured forces before the war and in the initial stages of the war. And Ukrainian armoured forces have been heavily supplemented by big supplies from Poland and other East European states of T-72s or modifications of the T-72 developed by and built in some cases in some of these East European states under old Soviet licenses. And Ukraine, it should be stressed, has received many more of these old, well, not particularly old, Soviet-era tanks than it has received Western ones. I mean, total number of Western tanks, tracked proper tanks, Leopard 2s, Challenger 2s, perhaps Leopard 1s that Ukraine has received, probably around 70 to 80, perhaps as many as 100, but in any event, the T-72s and T-64s still form the bulk of Ukraine's tank force. And if I could just return to the topic that I discussed yesterday about the video of the object that was destroyed in the fighting, I believe, on Monday, which the Russians claimed was a Leopard 2, and which it has been, some sources have said was actually an agricultural vehicle. I'm going to say straight away that, again, I am not going to debate this. I'm not able to analyse the photograph in any detail, but the general consensus now does seem to be that this was indeed an agricultural vehicle. There's some query about whether the Ministry of Defence, the Russian Ministry of Defence, actually published this photograph. I understand that it did. I haven't yet seen any specific link, and I will admit that I can't find this video myself on the Russian Ministry of Defence's Telegram channel. But again, I have to say this, I'm not the best person to be able to tell or see these pictures. For the moment, however, will go with the view that this was indeed an agricultural vehicle. As I said, that is the consensus, and that this was the Ministry of Defence that mistakenly published this picture. That is also the consensus, and I will say no more. I would reiterate again that when Shoigu said that 8 Leopard 2s had been destroyed in the fighting on Monday, in the statement that he made on Monday night, he attributes only 5 of these Leopard 2s which were destroyed to an attack by helicopter gunships, and the vehicle that we do see destroyed is clearly under attack from a helicopter gunship. So at least 3 of the 8 would have been destroyed by artillery fire, and presumably the Russians have independent confirmation of that, which doesn't necessarily prove, of course, that they are right. Anyway, I don't want to veer into this in more detail, but I come back to the fighting in Orekhov. My impression is that most of the tanks, the Ukrainian tanks that have been participating in this offensive up to this point, are these Soviet-era tanks, the T-64s and the T-72s that Ukraine had previous to the war, and which have been supplemented by deliveries from Eastern Europe. So that's all I want to say about this. Anyway, the bulk of the machines that have been used in this offensive appear to be wheeled vehicles, armoured vehicles. That could be for a number of reasons. It does look again as if the Ukrainians may be holding back their tracked vehicles, their Bradleys, and their BMPs, Soviet-era BMPs, for when they finally reach the fortified lines. Could be also, this reminds me of something that Brian Beletic said about tactics involved in attacking Russian battalion tactical groups, making a quick dash towards them before these battalion tactical groups with their heavy artillery can operate effectively. Anyway, it could be that the wheeled vehicles are being used because speed is of the essence, and wheeled vehicles are more capable of making a rapid dash across the steppe land, the plains of southern, well, the plains, flat lands where this fighting is taking place. But what is indisputable is that these vehicles have been destroyed in huge numbers. They've been easy targets for Russian artillery and Russian helicopter gunships, and I've been seeing lots of photos now, lots of video evidence, both from the fighting on Sunday and Monday, and also from these latest Ukrainian attacks, which have taken place near Orekhov, and they show the landscape littered with burnt out and destroyed Ukrainian wheeled armoured vehicles, British Mastiffs, American wheeled vehicles, French AMX-10, AMX-10RC wheeled tanks. There's been some rather pungent comments appearing from Ukrainian operators of these French wheeled tanks, who basically don't seem to think much of them. Well, I'm not particularly surprised by that. But anyway, it seems that the Russians have destroyed hundreds of these vehicles, and I don't think that is an exaggeration. That, by the way, brings me back to the topic that I discussed at length yesterday about Shoigu's claims about Ukrainian casualties in the first 3 days of fighting in further east. And I did express some doubt about whether the casualty numbers that Shoigu was giving could be correct, that they seem to be so lopsided in the Russians' favour that I did wonder about that. I've had quite a lot of pushback from this, and there's been some rather good articles about it from Simplicius the Thinker, and the point that's been made is that the Russians routinely claim that in the fighting, the loss ratio is 1 Russian soldier for every 7 Ukrainians. Now, Shoigu spoke about total Russian casualties of around 300 men, 71 killed, about 240 injured, so 300 casualties. The figure he gave for Ukrainian casualties was 3,700 lost. So 3,700 perhaps includes, well, undoubtedly includes both killed and wounded, and that would mean that the loss ratio was 12-1, which is significantly higher than the 7-1 that the Russians classically claim, but perhaps that's not so surprising, given the intensity of the fighting and given the fact that the Ukrainians were themselves attacking and were attacking against Russian positions. And there's been some comments, indeed some criticism, even from some Western commentators now, about Ukrainian tactics. A German journalist has tweeted that he does not understand the logic of Ukraine deploying a third of a battalion to a Russian minefield without any preparations made to clear the minefield, without any air cover and without any artillery preparation. And That's from a German journalist who has been a passionate supporter of Ukraine in this conflict. And I have to say I agree with that, obviously, but perhaps more pertinently do some military people whom I have seen. They all seem to be bewildered by these Ukrainian tactics. And if we're talking about the fighting in Orechov, near Orechov, I spoke about the fact that these attacks appear to be happening, appear to be part of this offensive, as I said, that Ukraine is trying to launch to the south. And I've talked about how the Russians have been using artillery and helicopter gunships primarily to counter it. But it's clear also that the Russians have laid large numbers of minefields in this particular zone. And one of the things that's happened is that, especially during the night attacks that took place overnight, but at other times also, Ukrainian soldiers and tanks and armoured vehicles have again advanced into these minefields with the consequences one might expect, given that these minefields have not been properly cleared. And of course there's been lots of discussion about the recklessness, even stupidity of advancing, sending wheeled vehicles and light infantry into a minefield at night. Anyway, that's commentaries that others have made. You can take issue with it if you like. But as I said, about the extent, the scale of the losses Ukraine has experienced up to now, I, for one, have no doubt the Russian Ministry of Defense has not yet provided a breakdown, but we can see, as I said, the landscape littered with destroyed and broken Ukrainian wheeled vehicles, armoured vehicles, and also, by the way, some tanks. And fairly recently, Swedish tracked infantry fighting vehicles have also been spotted and shown as destroyed, which may suggest that Ukraine has been trying to reinforce its forces from some of these more elite units with the heavier vehicles held in the rear. In fact, the commentary that I've seen is that Ukrainian progress has been so slow, or in fact so non-existent, and Ukrainian losses have been so high that Ukraine is being forced to commit troops and reserves to these attacks, which it had been intending to hold back for the breakthrough through the fortified lines. Now, if that is true, that is a disastrous situation for Ukraine, and I will say straight away that it points ultimately to the failure of this offensive, if it is true. Now, a number of further points to make here. The offensive is not yet confirmed by Ukraine. Ukrainian officials continue to deny that an offensive is even underway, even though we can see it. It's laid out in detail before us. We can see that it's happening. But as I recall, there were lots of commentaries from elements of the media in the West that Ukraine would have to achieve its breakthrough rapidly. Some people even spoke about within the space of a single day, because otherwise, in the absence of air cover and with heavy Russian preponderance in artillery, the likelihood was that the breakthrough wouldn't come. Well, I'm not going to go along fully with that. I certainly think that this offensive has more than a day in which to make some sort of major impact. But I also have to say that I think that the timeline can probably be measured in weeks at most, perhaps a month at the ultimate far end of this. And the reason for this is that the forces that have been committed to this offensive are relatively small. Some say 30,000 men in the Western trained brigades, a further 50,000 held in reserve. These are Ukrainian trained troops to exploit the breakthrough if and when it ever comes. These are less well-trained troops. But anyway, this is not a decisive margin against the forces that the Russians have in the area, who are said by some sources to number 75,000 or perhaps even more than that. So, and of course have the benefit of artillery and aircraft, air support. So it's probably already the case that Ukraine is feeding away, losing machines and people at too fast a rate for this offensive. And unless something happens soon, unless the Russian forces break, which for the moment doesn't seem to be happening, the prospects of this offensive are perhaps now clearly starting to dim. I would add that the other thing that must be happening is that it's clear that Ukraine is also trying to use a great deal of artillery. It's shelling Russian positions extensively, though not on the scale that the Russians are using their artillery. And of course the problem for Ukraine, as we've discussed many times, is that it has only a finite number of shells that it can use in attacks like this. Now, returning to that topic, I would say that there has been an interesting article on Zero Hedge, which has discussed the shells situation in the United States. And it admits that because of the enormous supplies of shells to Ukraine, American stocks are now critically depleted to the point where the United States may lack sufficient shells to conduct a major war. And apparently this has been privately communicated to members of Congress and is apparently well known within the military and political structures in the United States. Now, and that, by the way, despite the infusion of shells that's come from South Korea and Pakistan, most of which have probably ended up in Ukraine anyway. Now, if this is correct, and all the indications are that it is, then that, of course, also puts a limit on the amount of time with which Ukraine can conduct this offensive. It's been discussed that some of these attacks that Ukraine has launched have been conducted without artillery preparation. But when Ukraine has used its artillery, it has used it at very high densities, though not up the densities that match the Russian ones. But it must be already running through its ammunition stocks, and it's likely that these have been depleted already by the Russian missile and drone offensive, which, by the way, continues to be ongoing. So we have that problem as well. If expenditure of shells continues at this kind of rate, time again probably is going to start working against the Ukrainians very soon, and maybe starting to work against them already. Last but not least, I've seen reports that there are prospects for another change in the weather. Heavy rains are apparently expected in this part of Ukraine, again in about 4 days' time. And it's possible that these heavy rains, especially if they're prolonged, could again slow down any offensive preparations. I'm going to say one very last thing, which is that there's been a lot of discussion about training and strategies that the Ukrainians have used in these attacks, in preparing for this offensive. Much of what Ukraine is doing at the moment looks very familiar to me. It reminds me very much of the Kherson offensive of the autumn. Ukraine attacking, often in penny packets, throwing men and machines at points of the Russian lines, knocking, if you like, on those lines, trying to find weak spots they can exploit, doing so day after day, week after week, month after month, as it turned out, in the Kherson offensive, taking massive casualties, enormous losses in men and machines in the process. And I would reiterate again that there was that really rather haunting article that I read from recently on one of my recent videos, in which a Ukrainian officer was pointing to all his friends who had joined the unit that he was assigned to at the time when the war began, and identifying them all as killed, every single one of them. And interestingly enough, the place where they had all been killed was this Kherson offensive. So there's been no word so far about Ukrainian casualties, about dead and wounded, but it is not improbable that they are extremely high indeed, and would be, again, at least on the scale that we saw on the during the Kherson offensive, and this at a time when Ukraine, of course, has also further depleted its manpower base. On that front, by the way, just to reiterate again, point I made previously, Ukraine's population within the actual territory controlled by Kiev, according to some Ukrainian estimates, may have fallen to around 20 million. They say 29 million, but they're including the populations of Crimea and Donbass and other places under Russian control. This is a relatively low population to take on a giant such as Russia. Anyway, that's all I can tell you for the moment about this Ukrainian offensive that's underway. It's obviously the offensive underway. So far, the Ukrainians haven't even broken through the Russian zone of control, which is the area that the Russians, the control zone in front of their fortified lines. But they're continuing to hammer away and are experiencing massive losses in the process. Well, there's been a number of interesting commentary, other things going on as well. Now, the first thing is that at the same time as we've had this destruction of this Kakhovka dam, and I should say that again, I've been getting some more information about this. Someone else has come forward and on the basis of satellite data is again leaning to the theory that this is something that happened because of structural problems with the dam itself. I'm not going to discuss this further at this point. But anyway, at about the same time as the dam was destroyed, a pipeline from the Russian city of Tolyatti through Ukraine, presumably to Europe, which supplied ammonia, which is of course a key component in producing chemical fertilizer. That pipeline was also damaged and is now unusable. Now, this could have been sabotage. Others are suggesting it might have happened in the fighting. This happened in Lugansk region. I have to say again, to me, it looks like sabotage. And I would say that its purpose, clearly, is to jeopardize, to bring to an end the grain deal. And I suspect that at some point within the next few months, the Russians agreed very reluctantly to extend the grain deal a few days ago by, I believe it was 2 months. I believe that with Russian exports of ammonia and fertilizer stopped, this perhaps will mean that the grain deal is not going to be extended again. I mean, that seems to be the consensus view within the Russian media. And on the topic of the Kakhovka Dam, however it came to be, however it came to collapse, it is indisputable, I think, now that the Ukrainians are continuing to send more water downstream, increasing the areas of flooding in Kherson region. And much of this, as I said before, is agricultural land. And Boris Rozhin gave a detailed account of how this flooding and the loss of irrigation water to the canals that crisscross this area will reduce food production in Kherson region. And of course, now we have in conjunction with that the destruction of the Kherson, of the ammonia pipeline. And I wonder, this is another theory, I mean, these are just theories now. I wonder whether the real purpose of all of this is not so much to alter the dynamics on the battlefield, though that may have some part to play, but rather to scupper the grain deal. In which case, of course, this will add to the cost of food. Food prices will spike, and that will put further pressure on Western economies, including the European economies. There's now confirmation that the German economy is in recession, and today, just a few minutes ago, there was confirmation that the Eurozone economy is now also overall in recession. So perhaps that's a game that somebody's playing. Who it might be, well, one can speculate. But I did notice the Prime Minister Modi having given Zelensky his lecture at the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima, has apparently made it clear that he does not intend to invite Zelensky to the pending G20 meeting in India, which is due to take place in the autumn. So it looks as if this tense meeting between Modi and Zelensky continues to have its effect. Now, on that topic, there have also been a succession of telephone calls, 3 in a day, to Vladimir Putin from world leaders. The leaders in question were President Erdogan of Turkey, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, and President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa. One after another, each one of them called Putin. So on the 7th of June, even as the fighting in Ukraine is heating up, Putin had discussions with these 3 world leaders. Now, the Russians have provided accounts of these meetings. I'm not going to dedicate too much time to passing these readouts of these conversations, which don't tell us a huge amount. It's clear that both Ramaphosa and Turkey were again wanting to discuss with Putin, or in fact discussing with Putin, options for peace negotiations. Putin doesn't seem to have been altogether receptive, but he certainly didn't slam the door. He did explain at some length, however, why the problems of entering into peace negotiations might be difficult. But anyway, he doesn't seem to have, as I said, slammed the door in their face. And in the case of Erdogan, we read that Putin stated that the Kiev authorities, at the suggestion of their Western handlers, were still making a dangerous bet on the escalation of hostilities, committing war crimes, openly using terrorist methods, and organising sabotage on Russian territory. And of course that partly reflects the events in Belgorod, where, by the way, operations seem to have come to a complete stop. There doesn't seem to be any fighting anymore going on in Belgorod, though shelling continues. And Putin then goes on to discuss the Kakhovka dam attack, and we know that Erdogan has apparently proposed an independent investigation to find out what happened. There's no reference to this in this readout, but again, I get the sense that Putin was polite, but perhaps not hugely interested, if only because he knows that Ukraine will never participate in any investigation that Turkey sponsors, and that the Western powers will remain deeply unenthusiastic about it. But anyway, that was Erdogan. But Putin's conversation with Ramaphosa was also of a similar nature. They also touched on the situation in Ukraine, and we read, for example, that issues related to the well-known African initiative to find ways to resolve the Ukrainian conflict were also discussed, and it was agreed that Vladimir Putin would soon receive a delegation of a number of African heads of state. So the Russians are keeping the door open. But perhaps more interesting in the discussions with Ramaphosa and Erdogan is that in both cases, the Russian readouts suggest that the conversations were friendly and warm, and that the main topic of discussion was perhaps less Ukraine and the conflict there, and more bilateral relations between the two. And the conversation with Erdogan, for example, talks about mutual confidence that a multifaceted and mutually beneficial partnership in various spheres would continue to develop dynamically. In this context, they noted their commitment to consistent implementation of joint projects in energy, trade and tourism. And Putin again congratulated Erdogan on his re-election, and we read that the two leaders agreed to maintain a regular personal dialogue. So that looks like a strong relationship at the moment. And then with Ramaphosa, it's all about Ramaphosa's pending visit with the other African leaders to Russia. The two leaders also touched upon the preparations for the second Russia-Africa summit, scheduled for late July in St. Petersburg, and the upcoming BRICS summit in Johannesburg in August. And of course, the last is a tricky subject because South Africa is a party to the Rome Statute. It is in fact embedded in its constitution. It is under international law, apparently, under an obligation to arrest Putin if he arrives on South African territory. South Africa has, however, passed a law granting participants to this meeting immunity, diplomatic immunity. It could be that Ramaphosa is reassuring Putin that he won't be arrested if he arrives in South Africa, or it could be, as some have speculated, that Ramaphosa is asking Putin not to come because it would be politically embarrassing for the South Africans if he did come. We just don't know. But then the readout finishes, they express commitment to continuing close coordination between Russia and South Africa on international platforms. So again, a friendly conversation. But the most intriguing conversation of all was the one that Putin had with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, because this had nothing to do with Ukraine. Zelensky gate crashed the meeting of the Arab League, gave a rather abusive speech, basically criticizing the Arab leaders for their tilt towards the Russians. The Arab leaders were infuriated by it, apparently. Anyway, MbS has now had a call with Putin. It's a friendly call, and from the Russian readout, it appears that the topic of Ukraine did not come up. Instead, we read that the leaders discussed current aspects of multifaceted Russia-Saudi Arabia cooperation, in particular ways to build up trade and economic ties and implement ambitious joint projects in investment, transport, logistics and energy. And we also read that the sides also talked about various aspects of Russian-Saudi interaction at other multilateral organizations. Now, the key point about this is that the Russians have now confirmed that they are supporting Saudi Arabia's application to join the BRICS. So Saudi Arabia is going to join the BRICS, firstly as an observer member, but before long as a full member as well, and the Russians are backing this. Most of the conversation was about oil. They held an in-depth discussion of ensuring stability on the global energy market. Both sides expressed their appreciation of the high level of cooperation within the framework of OPEC+, which allows them to take prompt and effective measures to maintain the balance of oil demand and supply. They noted the importance of the agreements to this effect attained at the recent ministerial meeting in Riyadh. So the way I read that is that Putin agreed that Russia will cut oil production. The Saudis have announced a major production cut of 1 million barrels a day. They've been concerned that Russian oil production, despite the price caps, despite all of you have been hearing about Western attempts to interfere with the Russian oil trade, that Russian oil exports have been running at record levels. The Russians did previously announce a 600,000 barrel a day production cut, but they didn't actually implement it. Now they will. There will be a Russian production cut. The Saudis and the Russians are going to work together over the next few days and weeks to try to support the oil price. So just saying, you can see that Putin remains very much at the center of international relations. Even as Putin remains active diplomatically, cutting deals with the Saudis, talking to Erdogan, talking to Ramaphosa in South Africa, the Western powers are apparently trying to come up with some kind of solution or some kind of plan to address this gathering crisis that they're having in this conflict in Ukraine. Now, I've discussed many times that the Western powers, when this conflict began, never anticipated that they would find themselves in this position. The assumption back in February 2022 was that the sanctions that the West had imposed on Russia would break Russia, that they would provoke a political and economic crisis there, quite probably leading to the collapse of the Putin government, and that a humiliated and broken Russia economically would be forced to come to terms. I've been discussing this now for over a year, and I've been explaining how this is, how that was the initial calculation, and how it failed to come true. And ever since the summer, when it gradually began to be understood in the West that the economic wall that the West was launching against Russia was not going to succeed. We've seen the West drift towards an attempt to achieve the same thing that it failed to achieve through sanctions on the battlefield. And we had the heavy re-equipment of the Ukrainian military that took place in the summer of last year. We saw the subsequent offensives that Ukraine launched in Kherson region and in Kharkiv region. And we saw that those offensives also eventually ran out of steam and ran their course, and that the Western powers in the winter were left with a difficult set of decisions about what to do. Some more level-headed people, like General Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, suggested during the winter that the right thing to do was to open negotiations with the Russians to try to see whether some kind of compromise peace could be agreed. But that ran into huge opposition from the hardliners in Kiev, obviously. People gathered around Zelensky. The hardliners in Washington, with the most prominent hardliner now clearly identified as Secretary of State Tony Blinken, alongside, of course, his deputy, Victoria Nuland. Apparently, he's becoming too hardline, even for Jake Sullivan to feel entirely comfortable with. And at the same time, you also found other European countries, the British, for example, the Poles, the Balts, at that time, all unwilling to support peace talks. And on the topic of peace talks, we've now had some comments from the Russian Secretary of Russia's Security Council, Nikolai Patrushev. Now, Nikolai Patrushev, as I've explained many times, is the person who ultimately supervises the work of Russia's intelligence agencies. He is Putin's key foreign policy advisor. He plays a similar role for Putin that Jake Sullivan does for Biden in the United States, though it must be said that Patrushev comes across as a vastly more senior and more experienced, and I have to say, more intelligent man than Sullivan is. But anyway, Patrushev has made a number of very interesting comments. He said, he's confirmed that the Russians and the Ukrainians came very close to agreeing a peace agreement following the talks that took place in Istanbul at the end of March last year. He said that the Russian side approved the proposals in principle, and then what happened, and this is widely known, then what happened was that the British and the Americans intervened and the talks collapsed. Even after the agreement had been reached, the Ukrainians pulled back and suddenly told the Russians that they weren't interested in pursuing the talks any further and that they were taking back the proposals that they had made. So Patrushev has confirmed that. But he has also said something else, and it is very remarkable and very interesting. He has also broached for the first time, from a person as close to Putin as Patrushev is known to be, he has also said, repeating what was previously said by Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Russia's Security Council, Patrushev now is openly talking about the fact that this conflict cannot realistically end whilst the present government remains in power in Kiev. He's essentially said that Russian objectives cannot be achieved whilst Zelensky and his officials remain in political control in Kiev. And that is a major change in Russian policy. Now, it had been, to some extent, floated by Medvedev in his previous comments, but Medvedev, one sometimes gets the sense, is almost licensed by Putin and the rest of the Russian leadership to act as the hardline force, the person who's saying the unsayable things, gradually perhaps shaping the narrative in Russia. But it's never been completely clear how representative of Russian thinking Medvedev actually is, or at least of Putin's thinking. Well, in the case of Patrushev, I don't personally think there is any doubt. I think Patrushev would not have said these things, if he was not speaking for Putin himself. And bear in mind, we've had a lead up to all of this. We've had Putin's recent comments after the drone attack on Moscow, in which Putin also appeared to question whether the state of Ukraine had any viable existence anymore. And now we have Patrushev coming out openly and talking about the probability, the need for regime change in Kiev, given the failure of the negotiations that took place last year, and the manner in which Ukraine has conducted the war. And of course, we also know from various Russian officials, from Medvedev first and foremost, but also from Commander Abdi Alaudinov of the Chechen forces, that there are at least some Russians who say that once this Ukrainian offensive is fully contained, what the Russians then need to do is to go on the offensive themselves in order to bring this war to a conclusion once and for all. And this does seem to be the growing consensus in Moscow. In other words, after a long period of time in which the Russians have been first trying to negotiate and perhaps hoping that there might be a change of attitudes in the West, their position is now hardening to the point where they're prepared to take steps like seek regime change in Kiev that they were not prepared to seek before. And of course, that's probably also connected with growing confidence over the events, the military events on the ground. And I discussed earlier in this program the fact that, for the moment at least, Ukraine's Zaporozhye offensive doesn't seem to be going particularly well. And I would add that there have been many other attacks by Ukraine in many other places. So there was an attack yesterday in the Bakhmut area. The Ukrainians tried to capture this village of Berkhovo, which Prigozhin some days ago in fact, was saying that the Ukrainians already control. The Russian Ministry of Defense denied it when Prigozhin said it. Anyway, Ukraine did try to capture Berkhovo yesterday. The Russian military say that they completely and thoroughly repulsed this attack, and they provided video evidence which appears to confirm this. And the Russians have also now released video footage from the border villages in Belgorod region, which suggests that any attack Ukraine was making or seeking to make there has also been defeated. And of course, there's also been fighting further north around Kupiansk, and the Ukrainians tried to reverse the tide of events of Kupiansk and further south in Avdiivka, but all that was unsuccessful as well. Overall, one gets the sense the Russians are, at this point at least, more confident. They are looking towards some kind of regime change in Kiev as the only ultimate solution to this conflict. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're intending to march their troops all the way to Kiev. They may eventually be looking for means to replace the government in Kiev with a more rational one, as they would think, they might think. They might be looking to their friends, the Chinese, the South Africans, those sort of people, eventually to assist them in achieving that, trying to set up a new, inclusive government, possibly after new elections, which would be more amenable to negotiations. After all, something like the last was actually agreed by Ukraine as part of the original Minsk agreement of 2015. Anyway, that seems to me to be the direction of Russian thinking at the present time. The United States and the Western powers, however, will obviously not want that to happen. They will not want the war to end in that way. They will not want the Russians to retain control of all the territories that they do control, and perhaps enlarge their control across the whole of Donbass, and perhaps retain the land bridge and the 4 regions, and perhaps conceivably eventually even add to that territory. So what do the Western powers do? Well, there's clearly been debate, discussion, argument amongst the Western powers about how to approach this thing. And there's been some interesting implications again of the conflicts. We've had recently a very belligerent speech from Tony Blinken, as I said, the arch hardliner. There's been an article by David Ignatius in the Washington Post. David Ignatius is known to be close to Blinken. He interviewed Blinken a little while ago. Anyway, it looks as if Blinken, David Ignatius, through this article with David Ignatius, is also trying to find some means to prolong this war and to keep it going for as long as he can, and perhaps to escalate it. And in advance of this critical meeting that's going to happen in Vilnius, in Lithuania, bringing together all the NATO states, we've now had some comments from Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, and by the way, Danish Prime Minister, a man who is a fervid advocate of NATO expansion, and who has led a country, Denmark, which has been amongst the most hardline in policy over this issue. Anyway, Rasmussen is now openly floating the possibility of various East European countries giving Ukraine security guarantees and deploying their troops to Ukrainian territory outside the NATO umbrella if Ukraine is not given a rapid route towards NATO membership. And I can't help but think that Rasmussen is not doing this unprompted. I can't help but think that there are people in Washington and perhaps in London who want this to happen because they're perhaps starting to understand that Ukraine isn't going to win this war, that a military solution over Russia is beyond reach. They still balk at the idea of negotiations. Some kind of a freeze of the war might be an option that they might accept, but they want NATO boots, or rather Western boots, on the ground, and they're trying to rope in the East European states to provide it. So we see that the hardliners have not gone away. They're prepared to go a further step up the escalation escalator. And frankly, I don't see any end point beyond which these people would probably stop at, except perhaps the ultimate end point, which I don't want to discuss in this program. So the hardliners are mobilizing, and they want to take these steps. But at the same time, there was a very interesting report which I read on Zero Hedge, which says that members of Congress and other US officials are now being briefed about the US's own catastrophic situation in terms of depletion of its arsenals of shells. Supposedly, well, not supposedly, I'm no doubt that this is true, the United States has now shipped something like 2 million shells, 155mm shells, to Ukraine. And Ukraine has, in an incredibly short space of time, burnt its way right through all of those shells. And the US started the war with a production rate of 14,000 shells a month. It's perhaps increased it to between 20 and 30,000 shells a month. It's aiming to increase it to 70,000 shells a month. But currently, Ukraine is firing 130,000 shells a month. And of course, over the course of this offensive, its use of these shells is going to grow. So Ukraine is still using up more shells than the United States is able to make. And by the way, it isn't just the United States that has this problem. Europe also is apparently stuck. They're only able at the present time to make around 4,000 shells a month. So they can't really help out in this sort of way. Now, the United States, according to this article, has gone hat in hand to its various allies, to Pakistan, to South Korea. It's managed to obtain some shells that way. I've discussed how shells have been provided, supplied to Ukraine from South Korea, done in a hole-in-the-corner fashion, but it has been done. But never enough, probably only enough to keep Ukraine supplied with shells for a couple of weeks if the offensive continues at its current level of intensity. And in the meantime, the United States now itself is critically short of shells. And apparently, there have been warnings now given from Pentagon insiders to Congress, to the administration, that the shell shortage in the United States is so bad that at this particular present moment in time, the United States would struggle to conduct a war of its own. There might be plans in the future to increase shell production, but that will take a very long time to have an effect. And in the meantime, Ukraine is burning through more shells than the United States and its allies are producing. And it's not just shells. Now, one of the most dramatic pictures that appeared yesterday on the film that the Russian Ministry of Defense published, and this time there doesn't seem to be any doubt at all about the nature of the picture, is that an IRIS-T advanced surface-to-air missile system manufactured by Germany and supplied by Germany to Ukraine was apparently deployed by Ukraine close to the front lines, presumably in order to try to provide the Ukrainian forces that are conducting this offensive with some degree of air defense capability. It was spotted by a Russian drone, and it was immediately attacked by kamikaze drones, Lancet kamikaze drones, and destroyed. The launcher was destroyed. Now, this is an extremely expensive piece of equipment. Germany has only very recently begun production of IRIS-T surface-to-air missile systems, and here we see a clear-cut case, an indisputable case this time, of such a system being destroyed. And we are hearing reports about how Ukraine has run through more and more of its Patriot missiles putting to one side the question of whether all those launchers were indeed destroyed in that Russian missile strike of a few weeks ago. Probably were, by the way. But anyway, whatever. The US simply cannot afford to sustain this level of support for Ukraine for very much longer, regardless of what Blinken, Nuland, Rasmussen, all of those people want. And of course, deploying Western troops from Poland and other East European countries to Ukraine doesn't ultimately solve this problem, because if these troops were to find themselves in a conflict with the Russians, which is possible, highly possible in fact, the Russians might very well consider that it crosses their red line. They've actually said as much, in which case the Russians will respond and might respond militarily against these troops. Well, if the United States cannot supply shells in sufficient quantities to Ukraine, how is it going to supply shells and other weapon systems to these East European troops who would be deployed to Ukraine? How would the publics of these East European states respond if they are deployed to Ukraine? How would the greater European public respond? How might the American public respond also? Might it all in fact be ultimately a bluff if these troops are sent to Ukraine? In other words, an assumption, a very dangerous assumption, that if you deploy troops from Poland into Ukraine, the Russians won't attack them. What if the Russians do attack them? What does the United States do? How does it come to the rescue of these troops if its own military now is short of shells and equipment, and they've seen, of course, they've had exposed to them the effectiveness of the Russian air defense system? By the way, I haven't seen a single instance of Ukraine successfully destroying a Russian air defense installation. Just saying, may have happened. I've never seen it. I've never seen a single instance of such a thing taking place. But anyway, what does the United States do if the situation doesn't work out in the way that Blinken and Nuland and Rasmussen and all of these people think and hope? Does it escalate even further? Does it send in its own troops? Does it commit its air force to attack the Russians in Ukraine? Does it pull back? Does it negotiate? Does it want to be put in that position? And again, you hear all the demands, the discussions that are going to happen about freezing the conflict. But freezing the conflict in what way, given that the Russians are now talking about regime change in Kiev? Well, it's all very complicated and very difficult, and I'm going to say straight away, increasingly dangerous. And it's developing further dangers as well. We've seen the steps the Saudis and the Russians are now doing to support the oil price, and there's a strong chance that the oil price will grow at some point this year. The reason the oil price has fallen, however, is because somewhat unexpectedly, Europe is now definitely in recession. There were hopes, as I remember, in the spring, that with the European states having somehow got through the winter without significant energy shortages, that they would achieve some kind of a recovery this year. But in fact, it's clear that the inflationary pressures, the rises in interest rates are now, and the huge expenses that Western governments have had to take on, European governments have had to take on to compensate for the rises in energy prices, in energy costs. They've drained budgets in the West. They've fueled inflation in the West. They're causing interest rates to rise, and the Eurozone economy is now also in recession, as well as the German. The British economy is expected to be in recession very soon, and there are growing problems economically in the United States as well. And I can't help but think that in a situation like this, especially if before long we have a new government in Spain, voices might start to gather strength, demanding that there is some kind of change of course. So Vilnius is looking increasingly like a critical meeting. Do the Western powers, out of this misguided sense of solidarity they have with each other, doing what was discussed by Eve Smith in that fine article she talked about in Naked Capitalism a short time ago, do they spend all their time negotiating with each other how to escalate, but not escalate in a way that hurts them individually? Do they do that? Do they go down that particular fork in the road? Or do they finally acknowledge the fact that this has gone as far as it can and seek peace? And if they seek peace in Ukraine, how do they now confront what is now looking to be the emerging Russian policy of needing regime change in Ukraine? Now, it could be that come July, when the summit meets in Vilnius, these problems will have been solved. In that extraordinary article that I've discussed by David Ignatius, David Ignatius puts a positive spin, a very strange positive spin, on the progress Ukraine has made in its counteroffensive. And can I just say, by the way, that even as I have been making this program, the Washington Post, I think it's the first publication in the West, has finally acknowledged that this offensive is indeed actually underway. There's been no statement to that effect from Ukraine, but the Washington Post finally acknowledges that Ukraine is undertaking its offensive. So, David Ignatius says that some US officials, read from that, Blinken, are actually pleased with the progress Ukraine has been making, that Ukraine has gained more ground than they expected. I'm not sure where this ground that they see is, but never mind. So maybe the hope is that the West won't have to face these difficult decisions in Vilnius, that Ukraine might still break through despite the losses of the first couple of days, that they might still be able to penetrate these defences, reach Melitopol, capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power station, perhaps even break through as far as the Sea of Azov, do all of these things that we've been hearing about over the last few weeks. So maybe that is the hope, and well, possibly, who knows, it might happen. But what if it doesn't? Well, the neocons, it seems to me, now have their plan. It is to get Poland and some of the other East European states to intervene in Ukraine. I think it's high time that the realists, if such they are, or at least the people who want to, try to get off this escalator before it gets completely out of control, come up with some real plan of their own. One of the reasons why the neocons have consistently made the running in this affair is that to every meeting they come with a plan. Their opponents never do. They may have objections to the plan the neocons have, but as the opponents are never united and are never in a position to respond to whatever plan the neocons come up with, they eventually end up agreeing with the proposals, the extreme proposals that the neocons are making. So, given that that is so, I think it is time, if they want to avoid getting drawn into this thing even further than they already are in, those who are concerned about the ideas of the neocons and who should reflect upon the fact that neocon assumptions that Russia would simply collapse, implode under the sanctions blow have been proved wrong. Anyway, those people need to get their act together this time in Vilnius and come up with more realistic ideas of their own. I have to say, if they fail to do so, if we start moving along the lines that Blinken and others like him want to take the West, then we are in very serious trouble indeed. Let me repeat again. It's not just the West that can escalate in this conflict. Russia can and has done so. They've carried out mobilizations. They've ramped up arms production. They can probably do a lot more of that if they're pushed. But behind Russia stands China and Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen forces in Russia, has now shown off Chechen troops operating Chinese armoured vehicles, Chinese-produced armoured vehicles. Now, he might have obtained those before the war, or it may be that they've been supplied to Russia by a third country. But the fact that these vehicles have been displayed perhaps ought to serve as a reminder that China will not want to see Russia overwhelmed, to put it mildly. And its manufacturing capacity dwarfs that of the West. So, difficult decisions to be made in Vilnius. But in the meantime, it will be what happens on the battlefield that decides the course of this war. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again, more from me soon, and have a very, very good day.